Hello, welcome to the Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about player feedback. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
Well, it's pretty simple. On this podcast, we like to talk about games. Actually, I feel like player feedback is something that we've been slowly addressing over the past couple of months. As I have been enmeshed in the kind of controversy, I guess, about the Battle for Azeroth release and the feedback that's flooding into Blizzard about it. We've talked a little bit about some of the changes that have come through Pathfinder, and the player feedback, and so I feel like dedicating a whole real old episode is the way to go.
Sure. And this is your idea. So did you want to focus on specific pieces of feedback, or did you want to talk about the process?
So something I'm interested by, because I want to see, in a certain sense, I feel kind of like I am an expert, let's say, on sort of the WoW side of that equation, and I feel like you've been following the Pathfinder side of that equation much closer than I have. And so in a certain sense, I almost want to compare notes between the two. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To see, to kind of see what we get. And to a certain extent, I think part of that is a kind of misunderstanding almost that goes into sort of the development cycle. I typically come down on the side of devs, which should be obvious, right? I work at a video game company. I know devs. I know community people, right? So it's easy for me to kind of be I guess I'll just admit that bias up front, right? That when it comes down to kind of the fans complaining about something and the devs answering that complaint, I typically say, yep, the devs are right.
Yeah, and similarly, I don't think I'm as sympathetic to you on kind of expertise fronts, right? I think you tend to side with the devs more ideologically than I do. I don't know if that's the best way to express it, but in terms of software stuff, I am a software engineer, and the number of complaints I've seen, although I will say they have been less so recently, that are well, this should be a week's worth of work. And no.
Oh yeah, when people talk about how easy it is to code things. Yeah. Oh my god, that's my favorite.
How would you even know, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that reflects on devs. I have some of the Riot tech. When we used to play LoL a lot, I would read the Riot engineering blog because it was interesting, but just some of their posts about their refactoring and basically described, I think, for one of their projectile systems, and it was basically they said we had this whole bunch of spaghetti and then we cleaned it up, and we had this pile of spaghetti and then we took 3 months to untangle it, so now it's not spaghetti anymore. And sometimes that means that it was coded poorly in the first place. There's a number of reasons why you get there. That doesn't mean that they're faultless for it, but it does mean that maybe doing improvements isn't the easiest thing. But I think that's less kind of relevant to what we want to talk about, right? That technical stuff is, I think bears mentioning, but I think it's less relevant to kind of the ideal side of it.
I think I agree with you, because to a certain extent, I think I was very uncharitable to people leaving WoW feedback recently. And even though I kind of stand by what I said, I think a lot of people, especially when it comes to Battle for Azeroth, are acting as partisans, right? Where they are defining themselves and their feedback by their own sort of bias for the Horde or the Alliance. The example here is this interaction between Tyrande and Nathanos Blightcaller, right? Where Night Elf Alliance partisans were essentially complaining that it was bullshit that Tyrande, who is this uber powerful, high priestess of her goddess that just went through this crazy ritual or whatever, can't kick the shit out of Nathanos, who's quote unquote just a human, right? Or just a Forsaken, right? That he is not deserving of kind of fighting on equal ground. And from my perspective, I think that that's kind of uncharitable towards Forsaken players, right? And in a lot of ways, I understand the complaint, but this is a thing where kind of equity is needed and equality needs to kind of be enforced on both sides, and sometimes that means because if you're a Forsaken player, you don't want to feel like Nathanos Blightcaller is a weak piece of shit that can just be taken out in 5 seconds by by Tyrande. But the interesting thing here, and the thing that like really catalyzed this for me, is that they revised this stuff. They actually revised a lot of this stuff, which I don't think I have ever seen Blizzard do before, which is revise story level content, right, in order to appease people like from like PTR feedback. And there's a lot in that content that I think is like good revisions. There's a part where this, by the way, is spoilers for 8.1. So if you're trying to avoid 8.1 stuff, I'm going to be talking about it a little bit more in depth and more complexly. But so there's a part in 8.1 where Tyrande enters into like a big night elf, or I'm sorry, a big Forsaken fortification, and she says no mercy, right? And she locks up all of the Forsaken, but then she just, in the original version, she just left. So she says no mercy, but then she leaves all of the Forsaken alive. And so they changed that, so she walks in there and she kills all of them except for one, right? And I think that's a good change, right? Obviously, I think that makes a lot of sort of like a lot of sense and everything kind of like that. But the change that I found really interesting was they changed the interaction at the end in order to appease, essentially, right, like these Night Elf partisan players. From the way that I looked at it, Nathanos gets much more fucked up over the course of like their fight or whatever, and he also gets a buff from the two Valkyr that are with him, which explain how he is able to kind of go toe-to-toe with Tyrande. And I really don't know how... Part of me thinks that that's like a negative change, in the sense that I think the problem is a misperception of kind of like Tyrande or Malfurion's power level, if that makes sense. Where, like, yeah, if you are telling people that Malfurion is the strongest druid ever of all time, you kind of can't have him go up against, you know, like, he needs to be on equal footing with somebody like Nathanos Blightcaller. But the interesting thing is that they powered up Nathanos to that level, which I think is kind of obscene and a little too, you know, like a little too out there and crazy, rather than kind of just say, no, these, you know, like they're not as strong as you might think. But anyway, so all of that happened, and I was really flabbergasted to see like these kinds of story level changes. They didn't change everything, most notably the Dark Ranger stuff that I was talking about, where you know, people were complaining about how the Forsaken were running around resurrecting Night Elves into Dark Rangers, undead, you know, like undead Ranger elves. That those elves immediately turned on the people that they had like died defending. And while I kind of understand like the intuition there, I also think it's a part of sort of like the Forsaken fantasy that like you go and you do that. There's a long history of Forsaken kind of doing this in WoW, and they didn't make any kind of changes along those lines, which I think is like interesting, because essentially what this says is the WoW devs took a look at story level feedback and they said, you know what, some of this stuff is fair, let's address it, right? Which is really, I've never seen that before.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested by it.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a thing where like they saw it and said this is fair, and like they thought it was like so egregious that they had to fix it, and like they'll never do it again, because it is interesting that, or maybe I don't know, maybe part of it's a desire just to pander a little bit harder, right? Like this you know, what's the customer is always right, kind of in that sense, right? Like if they're afraid that people are actually going to drop out of the game if they don't address these things, you know, maybe the WoW numbers are more dire than we know. They stopped reporting them a number of years ago. I wouldn't think so, but
yeah, it has been suggested that the initial version of things was like unfinished, and that this is like the finished version of it. I think that's actually kind of a little bit half true. People have talked about the sort of like Tyrande killing the Forsaken as that, where if you played them back to back, it seemed as though the Forsaken were always set to die there, and that they just hadn't like coded in that
the triggers or whatever.
Triggers, yeah, that like triggers all of the Forsaken models to go through a death animation or whatever it is, kind of thing. But the stuff with Nathanos seems to not be that, right? That seems to be like a real and kind of like legitimate top to bottom change, to sort of address like their power levels in their fight. Um, so yeah, I think I don't know. I think that kind of stuff is really interesting. And the other half of this, when it comes to like WoW, is that there's a lot of talk about beta feedback. With stuff like Azerite armor, people have been leaving feedback since the beta, and there weren't a lot of changes. And now some of the changes that we're seeing to Azerite armor coming into 7.1, specifically that there's going to be a new currency that allows you to target specific pieces of Azerite armor, and that emissary quests go higher with Azerite armor because it's tough to get higher than 340 baseline pieces of armor. And so I thought that was an interesting thing, because it kind of suggests that to a certain extent the devs were holding the line against the player base, and that has since cracked, and in 8.1 they are addressing some of those feedback issues. But the question I have, I guess, is, do you see like a similar kind of like process in the Pathfinder side of things, right? Like, are there issues that Pathfinder people have been talking about, since, I guess we could call it
Gen Con?
1.0? Yeah, since like Gen Con or something, but that are only getting addressed like now?
Okay, so I think the single biggest thing, so there's two parts to this. The first part is that there's this kind of explanation of like design goals that kind of reframes this discussion, right? Like, I think people were treating this like a video game beta, which is like, this is like what you're going. This is, if everything goes well, this is what's going to be in the final version. And they've made clear that like when they had to choose between two versions of systems to test, they always picked the more extreme one because they could learn more from that feedback. And that it might be radically different in the final 2.0.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and this has some people worried because they're like, well, they're cutting feedback off, or they're cutting kind of like the playtest off in December, and they're going to just write the 2.0 for 6 months, and we're not getting any playtest time on that. And how could they possibly develop a game without getting our input, type of deal? Which, obviously I'm being a little bit uncharitable there, but that the point is if there's something bad in there, it doesn't get caught if no one looks at it. And I think that the single change there has been resonance. And they have said that resonance was kind of like the most extreme version of the system they wanted to test. But there was, I don't know if it was based on volume of feedback, but they definitely said, we hear you. The resonance isn't super popular. We're going, and so they said that they can't overhaul the entire resonance system for the playtest. Like, that'd be too big of a change to introduce in patch notes. But they did put out a kind of duplicate of one of the Pathfinder Society playtest adventures with a different resonance style system in it, to put testing on that system. And that system basically says resonance is the number of pieces of gear you can wear, and it takes away kind of like the needing to spend resonance to use consumable items and usable items. And then you get like a second pool of that's charisma based, of those numbers for both your spell points and for powering up items. So like consumable items have a base effect, and then you can power them up with one of these spell points to get a bigger effect out of them. So carrot rather than stick. And I think that's a neat thing, and we've talked about resonance, so we haven't actually played with it, so I don't have a good grasp on how it actually feels. But it's interesting because part of me wants to say, like, if they do want feedback on this. Another part of me thinks that maybe they're part of the reason, their motivation for doing this is to show that, this isn't necessarily, like, resonance isn't necessarily going to be in the end game, because I've seen, not a ton, but I've seen a fair amount of, like, my group isn't interested in second edition anymore type of thing. Or, we're just going to stick with first edition types of thing. It hasn't been universal. I also think that's part of the biggest issue that Paizo faces with this playtest is there's I think a fair amount of of feedback that's just like that is just this isn't first edition. That's bad. Make it like first edition. And that's kind of always the case. I think. Like I don't think I've ever seen a game product that has gone to a beta thing that hasn't been like, why did you change the thing? Um, um, in some regard. But that's kind of been the two biggest pieces that I've seen so far. There's a bunch of other little stuff that has been variously just like I think the something that has come through in kind of like the in between the lines is the way I want to put it. It has been kind of weird. Is so how like people are not super happy with this 1 to 20. Some people call it the treadmill, right? Like every level you get a +1 bonus. And people have been talking about, well, why not get rid of it? Why not make it half strength, right? And Mark Seifter, on one of their streams, has said, that's a great thing that comes in, that could come in as like a variant rule in either the Dungeon Master's Guide or something a little bit further down the line. And we're building this system such that doing that math shouldn't be difficult to do, right? Like it's not like part of the problem with Pathfinder 1 is that doing something like that, like pulling the base attack bonus out of Pathfinder 1, so fundamentally screwed with the game systems that it was really hard to do without a lot of major surgery on the rules. But this +1 bonus is so kind of like the way it figures into the math, it's so kind of, how do I want to put this? Not separated, but like partitioned, that removing it should just be a matter of subtracting some numbers, and it shouldn't be a big deal to do that. And so that kind of revealing, like making these rules modular enough that kind of thing can happen with minimal problems. And at some level, I don't think that developers are obligated in any way to explain their reasoning behind everything, but I definitely enjoy it. And I think it's interesting. I do think it helps calm fears in a lot of ways. Any thoughts on that?
I do. So something that the League developers said a lot. Part of me wonders how much of this is just about like when you as a developer kind of like open up the floodgates for feedback like this. What are you allowing into yourself in a way? To a certain extent, should you act as I guess like an equivalent example might be like Rockstar. Are there Rockstar people who are, monitoring feedback and changing the game for Red Dead Redemption 2? No, obviously not, right? Like, Red Dead Redemption 2 is the game that they're making, and they have a good sense of what that is, and they're not going through, like, a beta period or anything along those kinds of lines. But I think, you have to do PTR, and you have to do, the PBE for League, and you have to do kind of like a public playtest for Pathfinder when it comes to a lot of these sorts of games. And to a certain extent, you're kind of like, you just have to open up like the floodgates. But something that the League developers would talk about a lot when it came to, managing their community and interacting with the community. And they had a lot of encouragement for developers and designers themselves to go and post on the forums and talk to people about why they are doing what they are doing on the forums. In fact, I actually think that is one of the most interesting sort of time periods in League of Legends' career. Kind of that like season 1, 2, 3 period where there was a lot of developer talk back and forth on the forums for like how stuff worked and what it looked like, because you got a lot of insight into kind of like how they were thinking about implementing changes and what changes they would implement and why they wouldn't implement certain changes, because there's a lot of like bad feedback that gets to them, and they can kind of like quickly and succinctly debunk why this is a not good way to kind of like go about the game, right? World of Warcraft doesn't do that though, right? Like everything on the designer level gets filtered through the community managers or Watcher, the game director, Ian Hazakostas, who kind of essentially, I'm sure, repeat things that the designing team tell to him, right? Which is, this is what we thought about X, this is what we thought about Y, this is why we're not doing this is why we are doing that, kind of, kind of that sort of stuff. But anyway, so the thing that the League developers used to talk about all the time is how the forums are a vocal minority, and that you cannot cater to them exclusively, because even if they are angry about the game, right, there are a lot of people who are caught in like a kind of apathetic limbo that they don't want to kind of like screw with, right? Most people enjoy playing, League of Legends, playing World of Warcraft, and if you enjoy playing World of Warcraft, you typically don't get on Reddit and make a giant post about, how good the game is, right? But if you are having a bad time, it's very easy for you to make a big post about how bad the game is. And because that post is typically like angry, and anger appeals to people and gets shared a lot more commonly than, I guess, contentedness or satisfaction, right? It's a lot easier for those kinds of posts to blow up all over the front page and people to say, yeah, you know what, I never really thought about it, but I really agree with you. I think that this is bullshit, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of interested by like how, like it's there, you can't make every change that is asked of you, because obviously the way communities work is going to be working against you, and it's going to be kind of like riling people up against your sort of like practices. But like, how do you extract the grains of truth from that?
Yeah, no,
which is a tough question.
No, it's interesting because very similarly, Mark Seifter again said that like a lot of features, like, people are, the forums seem very negative, and it's like the surveys they get back have like some of these features have like 60 to 90% approval rating on them, and it's you only go make a post on the forum if you're really if you're really angry about something, you're much less to go and say like, I think this is great. There's also his point also was that like even if you do have those high success rates, right? Sometimes the people who are grumbling have valid points, right? Like, and maybe they're finding things that are edge cases that need to be solved, or maybe they are kind of like seeing into kind of the depths of the system in a way that a lot of players just don't ever encounter, or maybe they it's. Angry GM on, I think it's the last episode of Digressions and Dragons, put a point on this, something like this, right? Like, Ranger, like 5e has like a weird relationship with the Ranger. The Rangers, I think, generally viewed to not be very good. It's like, if the people who are coming to your game to play a Ranger aren't happy, but everybody else is, what's kind of your move, right? And sometimes that move is to get rid of the Ranger, and what are the kind of like balances around that? Another thing kind of in that Mark Seifter vein is like is sometimes, right, like sometimes you just have to ignore the people that are complaining, but also sometimes the people that are complaining are also like the people who, regardless of whether or not they are, they are the correctness of their complaint, they're the people who care the most. And so, right, like how do I put this? A lot of D&D and a lot of tabletop games can be fixed by a good DM. That doesn't mean the system is good. Does that make sense?
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, obviously, I am the kind of GM that I view the system as guidelines that I can freely and do freely tinker with as kind of as necessary. So yeah, I very much agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, the larger point being that like just because it works in 90% of circumstances, because there's an easy, like a competent GM can deal with it, that doesn't mean that you should leave the system like that. You should still put some effort into fixing that problem, into fixing those problems if you see them. That was the thing that I saw in like a couple recent angry GM articles, because he had one about how like the system should fix this thing, and then his next article is about how to do it yourself. And he, he's got a very interesting way of speaking, so I'll try and link them in the description below. But his discussion around this stuff is always fascinating. But I think it is important, right? That like,
yeah, in a way, I think that is a big divergent point from like the Pathfinder 2e stuff and like the WoW stuff, because there is, like there is that middleman of the GM. The WoW players really don't have any kind of control over like the systems that come in. Their only recourse really is feedback. But hypothetically in Pathfinder, right, like there is that middleman of the GM to kind of like mitigate some change. Like if some change you don't like comes through, right, you can just ask your GM to wash it and he can for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and they have asked that people don't house rule the playtest for feedback purposes, and that makes perfect sense to me. But there's even some level of that where, like, even if you're not house ruling anything, right, like the GM has agency because he has to, right, and so he might. It's not even at like the house rule level, right? Like some situation that isn't accounted for, he might just make a call and it works out, and maybe the system should be handling that kind of thing at that level, or like just guidance level type things, like like the game feel type stuff, I think varies widely GM to GM, regardless of like, even if they're playing the rule set the exact same way. It's just a radically different way of dealing with things, which is, I think, both a blessing and a bane to tabletop games.
Yeah. No, I super feel that, and I'm really interested in. I don't know. I'm like really interested in that interaction, I guess, between sort of like systems and how these things kind of like break down and work. In a way, I actually think Pathfinder really is doing the right thing by kind of like listen. I like that like angry GM ethos, right? That like, yeah, sure, hypothetically, the GM is the last line of defense and can fix the system on the fly or something like that, but we need to treat these rules as if they are always being run raw, and we can't allow that to kind of say, because in a way I almost think that like encourages like a certain sort of like laziness, where you go, the GM can fix that, something along those lines. In a certain sense, I think that it's proper to do it in certain places, right? Like, I actually think that Paizo would end up agreeing with me when it comes to stuff like the source books that come out, right? Like Ultimate Wilderness or whatever. A lot of these rules are very optional rules. And I think that that's an important piece because not all games look alike. And so, yeah, if you are running a wilderness campaign, Ultimate Wilderness is going to add in a bunch of rules for you, right? That you can kind of like tweak and plug and play sort of thing. Versus if you're running a political campaign and ultimate intrigue is the thing that you're going for, and you're going to be plugging in all of these rules. One of the things that I think Paizo has done a very good job about is kind of making things optional and modular, in a way that even like 3.5 didn't do this to a certain extent, right? Like, and I would say it's kind of like part of its problems. Like, it implicitly wanted to do this but never really presented itself this way. Like, all of the rules were, hypothetically there is a version of 3.5 where you play it and all of these rules are in the game, right? Because of the way that they are just like worded. But Paizo never approaches it that way, right? It's very rare that you would find a game that is using both social combat from Ultimate Intrigue and, the wilderness exploration rules from Ultimate Wilderness, because like, and even if you have those two, you're not using rules from, the tech
horror
guide.
Adventures.
Yeah, horror adventures, you know what I mean? Like, there is no version of Pathfinder that has literally every single rule in the game, just because that would be impossible.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I also think a part of what makes kind of the Pathfinder experience a little bit more tenable feedback-wise is that I think WoW is a game played by millions of people. Pathfinder, I don't like the community, I think, is just smaller, so it's easier to kind of like sort through it. Like, I think that it is not unreasonable for somebody at Paisu to have read every forum post. And I don't mean that like they should do that, but like it is something they could feasibly do, right?
Yeah.
Like WoW does not have that luxury. Like there's no way you could collect every piece of feedback from every place that people bitch about WoW or League of Legends, right? They're just too big. That's kind of like an advantage of being a relatively niche community. I guess the downside of that is that you can't as safely ignore some of them. But that's interesting. I wanted to go back for a second to the point where you were talking about kind of the developers, like this feedback in the beta that hasn't been implemented until this like 8.1 ish patch. Now you said you perceive this as being kind of like the developers holding the line. I could see like an alternate interpretation being like, they weren't listening or something along the lines of like they couldn't get the fix in fast enough for launch, so they held it off until 8.1 when they could be technically sure of it. And I'm like, just entertaining that is kind of like, assume that that's like a possibility. I'm not sure how I feel about like that as like an excuse set, if that makes sense, right? Like, we'll fix it in 8.1 type deal.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent it is something that players don't take into account, right? They don't take into account technical hurdles. They don't take into account QA and stuff like that. And I've seen this crop up in other spots. A lot of the time it crops up in class-specific spaces where, people will say or do or like request something which is actually like a complex technical hurdle, even if it sounds kind of like simple and straightforward. I can't really think of a good example of this off the top of my head, but like there's a certain barrier when it comes to like WoW or League of Legends that is only surmountable by technology and engineering,
like monk weapon animations.
Yeah, like it's just like. And sometimes those systems just are archaic. Oh, actually, a great piece of this is the backpack in WoW, right?
Right, yeah.
They said this for a long time. People are like, why, when we have 30 space bag slots, is our backpack still 16 spots or whatever? And they basically came out and they said, honestly, the backpack code is buried under so much other code that we just cannot, like, I'd love to make that change, but we can't. Because if we did, we would, completely futz with things. And that was something from like 8 years ago. I have no idea, like a long time ago. That now has been updated, right? If you add an authenticator to your account, you get 4 extra backpack slots. But yeah, so like that is definitely that's definitely like a good example of something where ideally speaking, we would like to see this change implemented, but like the technical hurdles of it are just so huge, we can't afford to do that.
Okay, so that's a longer term endemic issue. But the thing I was trying to get at, and I probably wasn't clear about it, is that like, let's say there's an issue, like people provide all this feedback for the BFA beta. And some developer says, I see that, I think it's valid, but we can't implement it for launch, so we're going to launch the game knowing that this system is bad and fix it for 8.1, right? And I'm not saying that that's necessarily what happened here, but it's something that I could definitely see happening in some capacity, at various times for various things, and just kind of the thoughts. There's part of me that says, this is okay, right? Like, this is the way that things work sometimes. There's also part of me that says, that's a shitty thing to do to your paying customers on launch, right? And I think that, obviously, I think that the answer is like, it depends on like the scope and scale of that change. But I was wondering if you had any specific thoughts on kind of like that particular interaction there.
I think it's fair. I almost want to say that this happened in Legion to a certain extent, which is not quite the same, in the sense that like there were a lot of things that so I think there's a big difference between Legion and Battle for Azeroth, just because Legion was a big overhaul of a lot of endgame systems, right? It was the implementation of the World Quest system, to sort of replace dailies, and it was the implementation of Mythic Plus, to kind of replace endgame, dungeon content, right? Like, it's no longer running a heroic or running a mythic. It's, this is the Mythic Plus. We're gonna run it a lot like we run, keystones in Diablo, or kind of like whatever else. Legendaries are a system that are kind of along this line. The artifacts are a system sort of kind of along this line. And I think that those things were so untested that it generated a lot of this kind of like these kinds of feedback and changes, right? In a lot of ways, I actually think that Battle for Azeroth and Legion have a lot in common in the way that they launched, because I don't think people really remember a lot of the problems to Legion in the launch. Like, I remember secondary stats were like a huge thing, and you could get like 50 eye level upgrades, but because the secondary stats were so out of whack, it could be a downgrade for you, and so they had to do all this item tuning in order to fix that. I remember, everybody was bitching about legendaries, including myself. I was incredibly disappointed to get Agrimar's Stride, which is just like a flat movement speed buff and not a throughput legendary, as my very first legendary, and that didn't get fixed until, I believe, 7.2? When they kind of implemented like a mass legendary rebalance. I remember, the Maw of Souls running, because all the Legion Mythic Pluses gave you the exact same amount of Azerite, or not Azerite, they give you the exact same amount of artifact power, right? And so you found the quickest one, and you ran that one over and over again, which was Maw of Souls. And all of these problems, I think, are problems that, like, could have been solved in the development phase. But in a lot of ways, they're just things that, when I think the development phase was too focused on getting these things up and running in the first place, because it was such a radical departure from the framework, that it took some time to sort of, put these things through the sieve and shake out the nuggets of gold that they needed, in order to actively kind of like implement those changes. What we've been seeing in Battle for Azeroth is a lot quicker turnaround time, right? Like that thing with the Azerite gear that I mentioned, that's coming in 7.1, but 7.1 is actually right around the corner, so I don't think that's, I think it is a result of that mostly. But they did hotfix the ability. They're doing a lot through hotfixes, right? So they hotfixed the ability for Azerite gear that came in emissaries to go up and up, because they recognized it was a problem. It was hard to get high level Azerite gear with the traits that you wanted, or whatever else kind of thing, just because you are getting it randomly through rolls, you were getting it randomly through Mythic Plus, or whatever. And so being able to farm those in a more directed way through emissaries was a better change. And I think that was a very good change, right? Especially given like the strength and importance of kind of like Azerite gear, right? If you have, and this is like, in Uldir the raid, the only piece of Azerite gear available, or there is one or two pieces of Azerite gear available to every class, but they were some of the only pieces of Azerite gear that scaled past 340, that like 340 level. And Mythic Plus was such a fucking crapshoot, right, that you can never like actually target a legendary in the same way, or I'm sorry, you target a piece of Azerite gear in the same way that you can in Uldir, because you have bonus rolls to spend on things. And so like these systems that they are implementing now are, like the fixes that kind of come in like that. I definitely think it's possible, and I definitely think that we saw a lot of that in Legion. But I feel as though that hasn't been the case in Battle for Azeroth for some reason. Maybe just like, maybe because Legion was there to dramatically overhaul the majority of these systems, and they carried that framework forward, they haven't really had to worry about it now. Do you know what I mean? And so that is a problem, I feel like, that's unique to the video games, because like, when it's Pathfinder, you don't have to deal with those kinds of tech problems. Maybe there's a version of that where you kind of say like, you can't print super complex rules because you need page space or whatever in Pathfinder. But at the end of the day, right, I feel like Pathfinder will never really have to contend with, I would like to make this change, but, you know, there is some hurdle in the technology, in the code base, in the engineering that we can't overcome.
Well, I think the biggest version of that is that once it's printed, there's very limited things that we can do to change the rules that are out there, right? Like, WoW could, you know, tomorrow take its entire code base and replace it with Maple Story 2, and like, you know, be like, well, that's the update. That's 8.1 is we made everybody chibi, and just, you know, clap their hands and say that's done with it. Like, Pathfinder doesn't have that kind of that kind of luxury, and on a less extreme note, right? Like, they are freer to make changes in WoW than they are in Pathfinder, because not only can they not like change the words written on the page, but they don't want to invalidate any of those rules significantly, because like it's stuff that, you know, you don't ever want to invalidate the old products, right? Like, that's why Unchained was all optional rules, that you know, by and large were kind of like, were neat but didn't get totally used and integrated. It was basically the only thing that got absorbed into core was Unchained Summoner, because the regular Summoner was so screwed up.
Yeah,
I think that's the kind of the biggest quote unquote technological hurdle to tabletop games. I actually, this is something that I've actually been super interested in, is a pen and paper game that gets patch notes like a video game, but I don't think it works because it's like a player implementing system thing. This is actually a really interesting thing because we've seen it, right? We as Paizo puts out patch notes for the playtest, we can see kind of some of the damage here, at least I've seen it kind of in the forums, is people being like, my group meets like once every 2 or 3 weeks at most, sometimes once a month, and we can't keep up with all of these changes. What the fuck, Paizo, right? Like, I feel like that would be like the biggest barrier to doing something like that in like a game that wasn't in playtest. Would just be like the kind of ability to keep like, you know, hell, I feel like most game knowledge is the responsibility of the GM in the first place. Like, I think that since we play with one, very crunchy players, and two, a lot of players who also GM, there's a little bit like that's a little bit less of a problem. But like, you know, I've been like, in multiple occasions, the other guy at the table that knows, like, there's a GM, and then like one other guy at the table knows the rules really well, and those are the two people who are like the sources of knowledge, and everybody else just kind of like, I have a vague idea of how this works. And, you know, trying to patch that actually kind of how is it, you know, to go back to my old sacred contract rants, right? Like, updating the rules on the fly when a GM does it, in my mind, is kind of like a violation of the sacred contract. It's still,
I know. I was about to say that.
Yeah,
like,
yeah. It's the same thing when the company does it.
When I made changes to Hell's Rebels, and I literally termed them patch notes. And not that was like a problem or anything kind of along those lines, but I think, you know, patches all the way, you know, like, I mean, people always say that buffing stuff is better than nerfing stuff. I don't agree with that. I think that that's wrong. But the kernel of truth in there is that when people get nerfed, it feels bad, and it creates a knee-jerk reaction of kind of like, a lot of the times, like, indignity, kind of, you know, thing where something I was doing was too powerful or too whatever, and it almost makes me feel like I'm a bad player for abusing this. Right, like, and I empathize with this a lot. This happened to me all the time in, like, you know, in like League of Legends or something, right? Like, if I'm playing Yasuo all the time and I'm like kicking ass with Yasuo, and then Yasuo gets like nerfed a little bit, it makes me feel like I've been playing unfairly for the past couple of months. Do you know what I mean? Because, like, oh, you've been playing an unfairly powerful character, right? So, like, those wins that you got, those games that you dominated were a result of, like, bad balance tuning.
Not because you were good.
Yeah, not because you are good, right? And that feels bad, right?
Yeah.
And I don't even agree with that, by the way. I think that is the wrong way to think about it, because I think so many of these tuning problems are marginal in the first place, right? Like, even with an updated Yasuo, even with an updated whoever, right? Most of the time, the game sort of played out similarly. And in fact, League of Legends gave us really interesting information about this, which is like the psychological effect of patch notes. Because there was one famous patch in League of Legends, it was like 2.17 or something, where the patch notes included nerfs to Vladimir that had been well discussed, well talked about on the forums, but the actual nerfs did not ship with the patch, even though the patch notes did. And Vladimir saw a huge decrease in win rate, right, in accordance with those patch notes. Even though he was just as strong as before, because the changes had never been implemented.
Yeah.
And there was a really long post about this by some of the designers who were talking about like how they picked apart that moment in their history and how interesting and informative it was to telling them about how people like talk about and react to patch notes. Because it wasn't just that, like, it was a couple of things, right? Part of it was his play rates plummeted, because he wasn't perceived as strong anymore, right? But part of it was things where it looked as though people were going on tilt with him more, where, you know, you would lose a kill or two, and you wouldn't say, well, I'm playing a strong late game character or whatever, I'll be fine. You said, God, I can't believe they nerfed Vlad so hard, sort of thing, right? That was one of the deductions. Another one was talking about how people played more conservatively because they felt as though, you know, they just nerfed Vlad. I know that with the old Vlad, I could have gone all in and gotten this kill or whatever and been fine. But with the new Vlad, I'm not so sure. And that sort of like uncertainty and doubt created less confident play that has like less upside and stuff like that. But yeah, I think that all of that stuff is, you know, the kind of psychological aspect of how patches interact with games is something that very much hits tabletop games and would be hard to implement because, you know, to a certain extent, I think players I don't know, but that's a little too harsh on players, I guess. I think players want to protect the experience, right? They want to protect the experience that they are having, and there are times when they will come into conflict with like GMs about stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this is kind of like harkens back to some of our older conversations about like rule of cool type stuff, right? Like you let them do it once and they want to do it over and over again. I think it's a cousin of that problem. I just kind of wanted to add on to your LoL example, right? Like in addition to like that, you know, failed Vlad nerf, I think the kind of more neutral version of it is like, I think Twitch got just a visual update and his like win rate shot through the roof for a couple of weeks, and like literally there was not only was there no change, but there was no like forecasted change, right? It just like was a result of kind of attention and you know, things like that. I think that this plays into some, so this is an interesting concept that I'm kind of bringing at the last minute, but I think it's interesting is that like the game space isn't as explored as you think it is, right? Like, this gets brought up in fighting games a lot because fighting games kind of had this competitive aspect long before the esports scene, which is where we've kind of seen this also. Like, esports kind of has grown up in this patcherific world. Fighting games didn't, and the way that got dealt with is, you know, like only in very extreme cases did things get banned, and people just like played to the meta, and then new tech got discovered as time went on, and just the play space, without any code changing, the meta shifted because the play space got explored more thoroughly and in ways that people didn't expect, just kind of over years of exposure. And it's a thing that I think we kind of lose a little bit of when we're in this kind of patch culture, as I'm going to put it. But it's an interesting thing to kind of think about, right? That
no, I think that's so real. That is a very real thing. The experience I have with that is from Hearthstone, because did you ever play with Zulok? Like that was when you played, right?
Briefly, yeah.
Yeah. So Zulok is just, you know, it's a very minion based. It's low cost minions with kind of so like Warlock has like discard cards. And one of the ethos besides Zulok is that you have life tap, which allows you to constantly refuel yourself. So if you are late in the game, you can be life tapping in order to draw extra cards, in order to play extra, But at its core, it is a very aggressive deck that wants to like win early, win hard. It wants to finish with stuff like Doomguard and like Soulfire and stuff that have these discard elements, but the idea is your hand is empty, so it doesn't even matter if you're discarding, right? Like getting 5 charging damage to face is going to like make the difference or whatever. And Zulak has been a product of like the Hearthstone meta for a long time, right? But one of the things that happened that was completely out of left field in one of the recent metas of the game is that Zulak came back, right? But it did not come back because there were any new cards. In fact, it actually pulled... People had been playing a version of the Zulak that included some of the new cards from the most recent expansions, and it was doing okay. It was like a tier 3, tier 4 deck, not very great, not a huge win rate, or anything kind of like along those lines, but if you're a big Warlock fan, it's fun. But then all of a sudden, somebody realized that there was an interaction between a couple of classic cards that made Zulak really powerful. The specific card being Light Warden, which is a 1-mana 1/2 that says whenever a character is healed, gain +2 attack. And Voodoo Doctor, a 1-mana 2/1 that comes into play and restores 2 health. And then a card called Happy Ghoul that says whenever a character is healed, this card costs 0 until the end of the turn or something like that. And so you can mana cheat out these Happy Ghouls by taking damage, healing yourself, and then you're pumping up your Light Warden. Your Light Warden is all of a sudden a 5/2 on turn 3 or whatever it is, kind of thing, right? And it literally, all of these interactions were caused by classic cards that have always been in Hearthstone since the release of Hearthstone. Light Warden and Voodoo Doctor have been in the set, and they have been strong cards, and they've had a strong interaction, right? But like nobody saw it, and nobody knew that was the case. And then all of a sudden, that deck is the deck that's dominating. When it comes in the run up to the new expansion for like a month outward. And that kind of stuff, happens, and it is crazy. And I think it very much backs up what you said, right? Like the game space is never quite as explored as you think it is, right? Like the metagame is. And I think people, they become slaves to, they become slaves to the meta to a certain extent.
I agree entirely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know, it's interesting. What do you think about just because we're kind of down this path already, about like, so this is a thing that happens in various capacities in fighting games is like tournament level banning of things rather than kind of like game level, right? Like where an organizing body decides that a certain thing is too powerful, right? Like one of the bigger examples I can think of is Meta Knight was banned in Italian Smash Melee tournaments. I think was the
Brawl. Yeah, Brawl.
Was it Brawl? I thought it was.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was Brawl, because Meta Knight was not in Melee.
Oh, good point. Derp. Yeah. But stuff like what do you think of that kind of that kind of level of player feedback, right? Because that is a form of player feedback, right?
There's a term for this that someone made up that I can't remember. I think it was called something like compression or something like that, which is essentially the absolute value that you would assign a game based on its floor, the difference between its floor ceiling its floor ceiling, its skill ceiling and its skill floor, right? Which is to say, essentially, like, what is the difference in ability between the number 1 player of Challenger and the very worst player in Bronze, right? Whatever the name for that is, I think is kind of what dominates this discussion. Because if you have, like maybe I would call that like skill inequality, right? where if you have a game with high skill inequality, right, where the high level challenger player is an extremely different player than the low level bronze player, just fundamentally speaking, right? The difference in skill between those two players is just like absolutely huge. I think it makes sense to do these kinds of like tournament level bans. In fact, I actually think that this is a problem that League of Legends has been grappling with for a long time, to a certain extent. And then the flip side of that is that if you have a game with low skill inequality, that you don't need to worry about that kind of thing, right? A game with low skill inequality might be something like, I mean, WoW to a certain extent is a game with low skill inequality. I actually think Hearthstone is pretty low skill inequality. I don't think that there's a huge amount of difference between top level Hearthstone pros and regular every Joe sorts of players. And that it's also very like skill elastic. If you spend a lot of time doing a lot of Hearthstone, right, you don't have to time Twitch reflexes. Obviously, you just kind of have to understand complex topics about like the game and keep track of stuff in people's hands and stuff like that. And I think that those are skills that people can kind of like pick up and put down pretty easily, right? And so like, yeah, so if I'm playing a game and that game is, you know, whatever it is, Street Fighter, Melee, whatever the most kind of like skill intensive game is, with like a really huge amount of skill inequality, when you are balancing by the top of that inequality, you have a lot of problems that can filter down to the bottom of it, right? And the League version of this is, you know, League balances its games based off of pro play in the LCS and like challenger and plat level play. When the kinds of play that you see in bronze and silver doesn't resemble that at all, right? And people are completely housing with characters that would never, you know, like with Master Yi, right? Who would never be anywhere near an LCS game just because he's so easily like counterable or, you know, skill tricked around sort of thing. And so, anyway, so if a fighting game says we're going to ban this for top level play, I think that is the right thing to do because you're not penalizing your low skill players, if that makes sense. Whereas if you say, okay, let me balance Meta Knight around low skill players, or I'm sorry, around high level players, low skill players with Meta Knight are now getting hosed.
Huh. That's interesting. I'm not sure I agree with you because I think that you actually do want high skill inequality in a competitive game, right? I think that if there isn't enough there, then it's hard for like games to be hyped, for lack of a better term. This is actually a big criticism of Street Fighter V is that because they've pulled out a lot of like the advanced tech, they've pulled out a lot of like things. They're called option selects, which is when you put in a single input, but based on context, it does one of two different things, both of which are beneficial. It's kind of like a weird win-win type thing. Yeah. These are things that have kind of like they're kind of like flukes of code and flukes of input reading. There were a couple of powerful defensive ones in Street Fighter 4 that really defined that meta. They've been regularly pulling them out of Street Fighter 5, but because they've been kind of like stripping out a lot of kind of like these unintended things, a lot of the top players feel like they don't have any space to kind of like carve out their own style, because there's just not enough options, and you just end up having to play like kind of like the very I don't want to say bare bones, but kind of like the very vanilla version of these characters, and that's not ultimately isn't as interesting on the top level because there's not as much room to kind of develop outward strategies or like feel out different things. And that's, I think, a very specific thing to fighting games because it relies a lot on kind of like slipperiness of inputs and code in ways that, you know, even if you're testing it, you've got like 10,000 monkeys banging against it. It's hard to kind of find all of those weird little interactions. But I think that's a very interesting point. I don't know. I feel like, you know, banning characters, whatever. I don't know if I have super strong feelings on that, but I also don't know if like the correct answer to bad players being able to do well with an overpowered character is to let that character stick around, right? I think there are better options for that.
I mean, this is like long time game industry like ethos to a certain extent. Like the character of E Honda in Street Fighter 2 is explicitly this, like a newbie character,
Sure.
like a noob friendly character, where
That's
you could win a match against a better player, right? Just by whatever
100-hand slap.
Yeah, I don't know if that holds up anymore. To a certain extent, I sort of think we've moved away from that kind of logic.
So there's a couple things there, right? Like that's definitely Ed in Street Fighter V. He's a character that doesn't require any motions to do his moves. They're all like double button presses, and he's balanced against the rest of the crew. It's just his execution barrier is lower. So here's I guess the kind of difference, right? Like having the execution skill gap be a little bit kind of fudgeable, I think is a little bit different than like kind of like the fundamentals of the mind games parts, right? Like footsies in Street Fighter V is a lot of mind games and a lot of kind of spacing stuff, and that's all independent of your ability to execute special moves at a certain point. And I think that I agree with you there, right? Like, for instance, in League of Legends, you don't have to put in this. You don't. Whenever you hit your ult button, you're doing your ult, right? You don't have to worry about, messing up the input and not coming out at the right point, which is a real problem in fighting games. And that kind of like, I think led to the popularity for while it was still around of, what was the name of it? The one, fucking Riot bought them. Rising Thunder, which was a game where the special moves were all single button presses and they were on cooldowns. And apparently there is some, like, Capcom does some balance around, like, difficulty of input in terms of how powerful, moves can be. And maybe it's not difficulty, but it's just kind of like Raw's, like, like doing a charge move in Street Fighter is not only harder, but it also like just straight up takes more time, even at like most mastered level, to do than a motion input. A motion input being a quarter circle motion, a charge move being like a hold back, press forward in a punch, or whatever. And so that's I don't know. That's I think that's kind of like two different vectors, but I see your point.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't have sum up thoughts for this. I just think it's a really interesting. It's like a really interesting interaction. Because nobody is ever quite right or quite wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some things that are definitely wrong, which is drive your game into the ground regardless of any feedback. I don't know if we've had any of those recently, but But I think you're definitely right in general, right? Like it's a thing that you have. It's a careful tightrope that needs to be walked in order to make sure that you're not doing anything like you're not giving too much power to smaller smaller voices and not also like plugging your ears and ignoring big problems they're staring you in the face. Yeah. Well. Anyway, how was your week?
Boy, that's a good question. How was my week? I have been fighting the urge to get Soul Calibur 6 all week. That's the big one. I'm a big fan of Soul Calibur. A lot of my fighting game kind of experience boils down to Soul Calibur because that was the game that I played like a ton of. And I even went to tournaments in New York City. I used to take the train into New York when I was like 12 to fight people as Mitsurugi when everybody was playing Talim and kicking the shit out of me. So now that Soul Calibur 6 is out, I really want to play it, but I also don't want to spend $60 for a game that I'm probably not going to go like super hard with. All of my friends have been playing it and doing like the custom, like the custom character stuff, because that's like one of the big draws of the game these days. I am also resisting the urge to like go out and spend $400 on a PS4 so I can play Red Dead, just because everybody's also playing that game and talking about that game. So lots of urges to spend money that I am successfully resisting so far.
Ah, that's interesting because I've been playing Soul Calibur 6 and Red Dead Redemption 2.
Have you?
Yeah. So Soul Calibur, I try and pick up these fighting games just because I've got a deep interest in them. As we've talked about a bit, I have a lot more trouble like with 3D fighting games than I do with like 2D because 3D fighting games always have like 1,000 more moves, half of which you're supposed to ignore. I think Soul Calibur has probably like the most flexible like movement system. It's just fundamental. Like my fundamentals were built in 2D fighting games, and you have to change so many of them. I haven't even played any online matches. I've just spent 2 hours in the character creator. I've been playing the Librum of Souls mode, which is their story mode, which is the most atrociously written thing I have ever read. It is so, like, the writing is like a 4-year-old, like, tried to write, like, the most basic story and still managed to fuck it up. It's...
That sucks, guys. One of my favorite parts about Soul Calibur 2 was they had a really neat interactive story mode.
Yeah, Weapon Master.
Yeah, the Weapon Master mode, because, like, you were moving through the map, and depending on, like, what... I guess, like, the map had a bunch of nodes on it or whatever, and you could choose which nodes to go through. And you were getting new weapons, and your weapons changed, how your character played. God, that stuff was so fucking cool!
Yeah. This has a lot of the same stuff. It's just, the writing is god-awful.
Who's your character of choice? Tell me it's Voldo.
It is
no, it's Yoshimitsu.
It's what? Who do you think it is?
Yoshimitsu.
So, back in 2, I used to play a lot of Yoshimitsu, right? Like
I fucking knew it. That's such a mango character.
No, he's definitely like the one I like the most in terms of like style, or like not
he's
style.
All goofy.
Yeah, but he's a stance character, and I can't handle that much information at once. So like when I'm playing, I mostly play Astaroth because he's the grappler type.
Oh man, I actually love Astaroth. Astaroth was always my big fan. So I used to play like with my friends. There was like a team mode where you would set a lineup of 8 characters and then like move through. And Astaroth was always my finisher because I felt like a lot of the time, like all you really needed to do a lot of the time, like let's say you get down to your 8th character. A lot of the time you can just like hit somebody once and just like whap a whole chunk of their HP off, and a lot of the time that would like win me stuff and like that. I really like Astaroth. I really like Astaroth a lot.
Yeah. See, so my big thing when I was playing with my brother a lot was Raphael. I guess we just like didn't understand like how to sidestep it all because like the kind of like
his top 3 vertical that thing. Yeah.
We couldn't fit like it was always like an instant lockout. It was like infuriating for whoever was on the receiving end of it because you couldn't figure out how to get out of it. But yeah, what else? Like I also have a soft spot for Maxi, just because like the nunchucks, like you just kind of, it probably is less smooth than it is in my memory, but it's kind of like the ability kind of to infinitely chain attacks together and just kind of like dance across the battlefield always felt fun.
Maxi is a character that I always wanted to be good with, but I never could get there just because like he's not like Ivy in that game was really hard. Because like all of her really good moves were built around chaining these things together in like really long and complex combos that I just couldn't, put together.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some like the it's really neat to just screw around the character because I don't really like Astaroth's kind of vibe, as it were, right? Like I am much more a goody two shoes. So like, one, you can go to the character creator and you can like, you can change the stock. Like you can put equipment on the regular characters, right, and change up their outfits and stuff, which is really neat. I have it on good authority that the top use for it is to pull off Raphael's glasses because they look fucking stupid. And then you can also like build your own characters that that use the moveset, right? So I've got like there's like 12 races too. It's crazy. But I have a Colossus dressed up kind of like a pirate that uses the Astaroth moveset. I like it a lot. So it's definitely a good time. Plus like the wacky stuff you see people doing online. My favorite thing was I was scrolling through like the interface for like seeing other people's custom characters is god awful, but it's like it pops up and you have to like scroll through them one at a time and you can't like go back. There's like no like search function or anything. It's really atrocious. But I like scrolling through and there's like a bunch of like people making versions of like popular characters, right? Like and there was one for 2B, right? Like from Nier Automata.
Right.
And there's been a bunch of them, and they've been kind of passed around the internet. And then, like, yesterday, they announced that she's going to be a guest character in the game. So we'll actually get her, like, for real. in the game, and everybody's excited because you'll probably be able to make 9S and what was it, A6? I forget. Like make the other characters from Nier in the game using her moveset and her base stuff. So everybody's pretty hype about that. Red Dead Redemption 2, on the other hand, has been a kind of a really interesting experience. It's really pretty. This one feature that I didn't think I would care a lot about is you can hold down a button and it goes into what's called cinematic mode, and as you're moving, the camera kind of pans around you like it's a Western film, and they fucking nailed it. It looks perfect, and it doesn't like I don't ever use it when I'm actually actively doing anything. But there are a lot of missions where like you'll be riding along in a group and you'll be following other people, and you just hold the button to do that, and you'll be having conversations while it's happening. And so instead of the camera being behind me, I just hold the cinematic button and like hold the ride along button and just like let it play out in front of me. It looks like a Western, and I fucking love it.
That's interesting. That's actually tech that they had in Grand Theft Auto 5, but it was really awful because like you would activate cinematic mode and it would make your car and you were driving your car, right?
Right.
But the thing is that like this is the true of any open world game with like a vehicle, with like roads and stuff like that. You are always incentivized to stay on the roads on a car, obviously. But the way like driving typically works is you're not moving at a normal, you're going as fast as you possibly can. So like when you activate cinematic mode and you're not looking where you're going, you instantly crash like every time. So I remember when Grand Theft Auto 5 came out, I was like, why? And it's a really important button too, if I remember correctly. It's like one of the face buttons or something like that. And so it's very easy for you to accidentally hit it and find yourself in cinematic mode and then like tumble off a cliff or something. Because like, you enter cinematic mode and it like shows you your wheel from up front, and I'm like, listen, if this was a Fast and the Furious movie, I think this shot would be great. Okay, but we're in Grand Theft Auto, and it's a guardrail, and I'm plowing through it, and I'm wasted. Thanks. So that is really funny because that's just really funny.
I'm definitely not using it when I'm actually actively controlling anything. It's only when I'm like following stuff. A little bit sometimes when I'm like following the road, although that doesn't work as well as it did in The Witcher. Like the kind of like hold the button and your horse just runs along the road type stuff. But it mostly works. And like I said, when you're in like a group and you're just kind of following along, it works great. It looks really pretty. Also some interesting stuff. There's no fast travel. There's like stagecoaches, but they're like to very specific points, and you have to like go.
Oh,
to the,
nice.
And
I love that. I think fast travel is typically a killer of games for me sometimes.
Yeah. I definitely feel
like with Skyrim, I can't fast travel. If I ever start fast traveling in Skyrim, I immediately lose focus and can't play anymore, right? Because it's too easy and it's not, and like the immersive majesty that is Skyrim, right? Doesn't work for me if I'm fast traveling. So, but I can use, because they have stagecoaches in that game too, where you can travel between any of the different cities. And so you can use those to get around the map.
So the thing I think that really sells it is that there are random events that pop up in between, and they happen at like the perfect rate, so that like you'll get like one, maybe two on a long journey. And you can choose to ignore them if you want, or you can choose to kind of go off and interact with them. And it definitely hits kind of like the right balance of, this is a thing I want to do on the way to something else, and like maybe I'll ignore it. And I think another important part of it too is that, horses are such an integral part of the game that you're like you always have at least that rate of speed. I feel like Skyrim suffers a little bit from the fact that, it's slower. You're on foot for the beginning part of the game. If I had to be on foot for Red Dead Redemption, I think I would shoot myself. The walking speeds are a little bit slow and you control a little clunky, which is fine because you're mostly on the horse. But like the worst part of the game for me is walking across your home camp, because not only do you have to walk, but they like significant, like they keep you from sprinting. So like you just have to like mosey across the camp. It's just like, God damn it, move just like a little bit faster and I'll be all right. Especially for like when you have to deal with somebody who's on the edge of the camp instead of in the middle of the camp. But it's still very fun. It's totally my jam in terms of like, I love guns from that era, right? Like, you know, bolt action, lever action, kind of revolvers, that kind of stuff is just so much fun to me. Um, so I've been having a great time with that. Like before we started recording, I was literally sitting and playing Texas Hold'em for a quest, which was neat. Um, there's some things that I'm not so sure, like one of the things you can do to gain like respect in your camp is you can do chores. And you know, that's neat. It's like a little thing I do every once in a while, but it's also kind of like the worst gameplay. Like, is literally you pick up a you pick up a sack and you walk very slowly across the camp, and then you put it down in the place where it needs to be. And it's like, congratulations, you've done a chore. And I'm like, why am I doing chores in this video game? I don't play video games to do chores. I do video games because I don't want to be doing chores.
Is there a story? Like, what's the
okay?
like
So
the impulse for the story mode?
So you're playing as Arthur Morgan, who I believe is one of the characters from the last game, because John Marston shows up very early. I don't think that's a spoiler. It's very early.
Okay.
You have to go help him. And you haven't interacted with him much. So you played through the first one, right?
Yeah.
I never did. I know kind of like the ending is, right? It's like your character dies and you play as his son and he gets revenge, right?
Yeah, John Marston dies, and then you play as Jack Marston, his son.
Interesting.
To finish out the game.
Very interesting, because John Marston. So what has happened in the game is, at some point in the past, John has abandoned Dutch and the crew for a year, and he's come back. Is that something that happens in the game?
Is Dutch
is like
in the game?
Yeah, he's like your leader.
Oh my God, that's really cool. So okay. So Red Dead Redemption 1 is all about killing Dutch, right? John Marston is out of the game. He's a rancher. And then two guys from the federal government come and they say, hey, listen, we have all this evidence of all the crimes that you've committed, right? And I think it's actually the 1900s. I think it's like 1905 or something like that.
So this is a prequel? Maybe?
Yeah, this is a prequel then. And he's like, but we want to kill your old gang leader, what's his face?
Dutch?
Dutch, I just said it. He has this new gang. They're terrorizing or whatever. So your mission is to kill Dutch, or else we're going to prosecute you and, like, fuck your shit up. And so John Marston has to go be a cowboy again to go kill Dutch in order to, like, I think it's like to not lose the farm or something along those kinds of lines. And I think he does successfully kill Dutch, but then he dies afterwards or something like that. But the really interesting thing is that, like, so the game is super satirical, right? So like basically everybody is satirized except for Dutch, who is played dead straight as kind of like the lost cowboy archetype. And like his whole gang is filled out with Native Americans that have been like displaced and fucked on by like the federal government and stuff like that. And so like you have this whole game where a lot of people are essentially kind of like caricatures, or they're like satirizing some like stereotype, right? Like there's this Mexican outlaw that you're working with, and right, but he's a huge piece of shit, and then the Mexican dictator is also a huge piece of shit, and like all this other sort of stuff. But then you meet Dutch, and he is there, and he's like, the West was not made for civility. These people are killing what made it great, and I'm not going to surrender to the like the civilization of like the West or whatever. And he is a it's like he's talking to the camera, a lot of it, where he's just saying like, I want to be a cowboy, right? Like, and I want to live the Wild West life, and the Wild West life is being stripped from me, and I refuse to let that happen. And that's like the core conflict, and I think that that's really cool, and it's one of the reasons I think Red Dead is such a good game. So the idea that you get to come and interact with Dutch is awesome.
Yeah, no, it's. I'm looking at the Wikipedia page, and it says it's a prequel, which is super interesting. I think it takes place in 1899.
Okay.
If I remember correctly, that's super interesting. I didn't realize that you're busy. You're trying to kill Dutch in the first one. That's really interesting because he's kind of played as like the charismatic, but like scoundrel with the heart of gold type, right? Like that, he really believes that he's doing good, even though he's like, doing crimes and killing people.
Yeah.
He's like ultimately a good guy is kind of how he's played. And like kind of one of the themes is that like the age of the Old West, the legend of the Old West is coming to an end. And like maybe like what are we doing here? That's really interesting, huh? Well, I'll have to see how that goes then. So I guess that year that John Marston has left the group must be pre this. Is there an Arthur Morgan character in Red Dead Redemption 1?
I actually don't remember. There are a lot of different characters in Red Dead Redemption 1 who kind of like show up. A lot of them are like archetypes of some variety or another. I'm looking it up. I actually don't see. Yeah, he does not seem to be. He does not seem to be in Red Dead Redemption 1.
Yeah. Interesting. Doesn't look. I can't see him as being in the first game, so he must just be, which makes sense. I think he's like an older and more experienced member of the crew. I also have to believe that means he's gonna like die at the end of this game, which makes sense. I'm trying not to spoil myself on it. But yeah, 1899 is definitely when the game takes place.
Okay, yeah, and then 12. So 1911 must be when Red Dead Redemption 1 takes place, because I'm reading it says 12 years after.
Yeah, okay, so that's like right at the end of the. So I was curious, so I went and looked at it, and like the Legend of the Old West is like 17, like turn of the century, 1800s to like 1915.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I don't know. This is kind of like only vaguely related, but like, starting to play this game and maybe really want to play a tabletop version of the Old West, and then it's like, and that's like this, like, I always kind of associated with steampunk, and like it's weird to me that like the Victorian era and the cowboy era are like the exact same eras, but like in different places, right? Like the old West is the American Victorian period, which is just super weird to me.
Yeah.
But super cool.
Yeah, that is actually kind of weird, and it's funny that we get so many like steampunky kind of we get so many steampunky London games, and we never get like a steampunk Western game. It feels like.
I mean, did you remember
like,
Wild Wild West starring Will Smith?
I mean, I do, and I have an unabashed love for that movie. But
speaking of movies, I have an unabashed love for. I went and saw today. Actually, I saw Bad Times at the El Royale.
Oh, how was that?
It
Drew
was
Goddard.
Sorry,
Drew Goddard. Sorry,
is the director?
That's the name of the director. Yeah.
Has he done anything else?
He did Cabin in the Woods, is the big famous one. He also did the first season of Daredevil. I'm not a huge fan of Drew Goddard, but yeah, he's been around the block. He's been all over projects. This is one of the first big one of the first big projects that he really took for himself.
Yeah.
He wrote Cloverfield. I think that was the first thing that really brought him into the put him on the map. Yeah.
So I really like the movie. So I like movies that are kind of like oozing with style. And this movie has style, but it's not oozing with it, right? Like I like Coen brothers I like, Wes Anderson. This is less that, but still has a fair amount of style. Um, and it's just super interesting, right? Like it's a weird kind of like comedy of coincidences in some level, right? Like there's like 5 or 6 people at this hotel, all there for different reasons, and their like plots are just intertwining in the worst ways and just screwing each other over. But it's really well done. It's set well to the music, which is always a big thing for me. Um, there's like a big, it's not like a twist per se, because it's a revelation about one of the characters' backstories that just like really kind of like flips your whole perspective on who he is. That really caught me by surprise, and I really appreciated. Just the whole thing is just super fun to watch. If you, for people at home who don't know, kind of the thing that you know going into it, or like, you know, within the first couple of minutes, is somebody buried or hid a suitcase full of money in the floor of the El Royale 10 years ago, and now 4 people have showed up, and that's actually only one of the threads. The other 4 are like completely unrelated to that. There's the guy who runs the front desk, like there's the bellboy who runs the front desk. There's a black singer who's on her way to sing in Reno because she's kind of she because she couldn't make it in show business, I think, the way it's supposed to be portrayed. There's like a girl who shows up and just like is just like wants room and is being really aggravated, like really kind of bitchy, and then like a vacuum salesman who is the most obnoxious person on the planet. And it just goes from there. It's really great. Like things turn like I won't spoil it, but like one of those characters turns out to be very different from the person. Oh, and then the other person who shows up is Jeff Bridges playing a priest, Father David Flynn. One of those characters turns out to be not anything like he said he is, and it's not like in the trailer. Jeff Bridges says, "I'm not a priest," and it's not that one. That's not the one I'm talking about. But very quickly, things change and spin around, and it's got like it's just really satisfying. I highly recommend it to everyone. I had a little trouble finding it in theaters at this point. It's like a couple weeks out. It came out on the 12th, I think. But if you can get it on like what would it be, like instant access in the next couple weeks streaming, I would highly recommend it.
That's cool. Yeah, I don't know. That is super cool. You know, you speaking also of movies that we like. I can't remember how we phrased it, but Teen Titans Go to the Movies came out, and I bought it and watched it.
Of course you did.
And I just wanted to share that. Do you remember the upbeat song about life?
Vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, the Michael Bolton song.
Yeah.
With them running like the tiger with the guitar over.
Yep. Yeah. No,
I remember loving this movie. Obviously, we just watched it 3 months ago.
Yeah.
Right? And it was so funny to me how much I found new and funny in rewatching it, and that was like the big one. I was like, oh, I remember this song, but I had completely forgotten that it ends with them running him over, and then Cyborg goes, I think his dad's a cop, run. Oh my god. Oh man, you know, I really hope Aquaman is great. I think Aquaman looks amazing, but boy, I feel like Teen Titans Go to the Movies might be my favorite movie of the year. Just like, it's so good. You know what else I've been watching? God, we don't have any time to talk about this, but I do want to talk about this. I've been watching a lot of lawyer movies from the 90s.
Oof, like
have you seen any of these?
A Few Good Men.
So yeah, I did watch A Few Good Men. That was kind of like what started me on this like kick to a certain extent. So the Wired YouTube channel has this thing called like Technique Critique, where they get a linguist in, and he talks about people's dialects in in like and accents and fake languages in movies, just like anything about like language in movies, and it is fucking fascinating. It's so cool. And I ended up kind of going on this like kick of like watching YouTube videos of like prominent professionals in their field addressing how movies display their profession. And I ended up looking at one, I guess Legal Eagle has a lawyer who talks about like lawyers in movies or whatever. And I had no idea. I know a few good men because of Alan Sorkin and You Can't Handle the Truth, but I never really understood the context of it. So I watched it front to back, and now I understand like the full context. I watched 12 Angry Men. I've been watching The Rainmaker. And anyway, and all these like prominent like lawyer movies. Are you like a fan of like lawyer movies? Like I know you get like really into like the Supreme Court and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, that's a relatively recent thing on my part, so I haven't been as deep into kind of like the classic stuff. I watched Liar Liar. I think it's either Liar Liar or Big Fat Lie. The one where Jim Carrey has to tell the truth for like 24 hours.
Yeah. I remember that movie.
That's the most prominent lawyer movie that I can remember having watched. Or like The Mighty Ducks, because that counts as a lawyer movie, right?
No way. Really?
It really doesn't. But Gordon Bombay is a lawyer. And then he gets caught drunk driving. He has to coach the Ducks. So it really has nothing to do with being a lawyer. It just comes back in the third movie because, like, I think he he's not a major part of the movie, but he like shows up in like a cameo to prevent them from like losing their scholarship somehow, using like legal magic. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've seen the Mighty Ducks, and I think they're not actually good. I feel like I read somewhere that they're not actually good, and I feel like I just want to like leave my like precious childhood memories intact, and just not ruin it for myself. So maybe I'll just never watch the Mighty Ducks again. I watched this movie so many times when I was a kid because my brother was really into hockey. I remember them being vaguely uplifting.
I super feel that. I feel like lawyer movies are kind of like cheap drama, which is why I think, by the way, they ended up moving to television.
Makes sense.
For like Ally McBeal and like Boston Legal or whatever, because you can just center an episode around, like, oh, let's win this weird case, win this upcoming, case or whatever sort of thing. And in a certain sense, I almost think that there's something a little bit more to it, in the sense of like, I sort of kind of wonder if there's some sort of like falling effect of like genres kind of fall through movies into television, because it seems actually kind of compelling to me. But anyway, this all kind of started because of Better Call Saul, which is obviously a lawyer show, and a very good lawyer show. And so that's the other thing that I've been doing this week is watching fucking lawyer movies. There aren't a lot of recent lawyer movies also, it feels like.
Yeah, so I feel like I wouldn't be as big of a fan of lawyer movies because like the things that interest me about the law are kind of like technical considerations and like the shape and the feel of the law, and like every lawyer movie is some variation of like, this is the law, but I have to not do it because of reasons, or something like that, right? Or like, basically it can't be like too technical because otherwise no one would care to watch it, right? Like, so I feel like that's not something I particularly enjoy, but maybe I'll check out.
Yeah, I mean that's something that I learned about A Few Good Men. Like, if that dramatic courtroom, he's on the witness stand and he says that you can't handle the truth thing or whatever, right? Like that it not only so like there's a certain amount of it that's like, okay, you never like that would never happen in real life just because people coach their witnesses, right? And their witnesses like only answer certain types of questions and stuff like that. But just from a perspective of like, what could anyone do in a court right? Everyone is in contempt of court because they're all like yelling at each other, and the drama works out, obviously, right? But it's just like it doesn't make any sense at all when it comes to. In fact, this is kind of what I was talking about when we were talking about Lincoln forever ago. That I thought was really interesting about like Lincoln as like a political movie, because it did get like wonky. You know, and he's sitting and he's talking about like, well, you know, if I let this thing happen, then the Supreme Court is going to come back into session, and they're going to strike it down or what, you know, like, or whatever else kind of thing. And so, you know, Lincoln makes a very real and complex political case for why he needs to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments now, right? Versus after the reconciliation of. After like the reconciliation at like the end of the Civil War. And I like that it wasn't willing to kind of like shy away from the truth of that situation, right? It wasn't just like, oh, we need to pass this because it's the right thing to do. It's like, no, like that's the cheap answer, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I feel like we've run over a bit, so I feel like that's about it for today's show. If you'd like to write to us and tell us what you think about player feedback or A Few Good Men or any of the other things we talked about on the show, you can reach us at somederpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast at somederpsplaygames.com. You follow us at twitch.tv/derpsplaygames, even though we haven't played in forever. These episodes go up on YouTube, link in the description. Leave us likes and subscriptions everywhere, comments on YouTube, or not YouTube, on iTunes, reviews. Smash that like button, jackhammer that subscribe. Yeah. And last note, if any of you are going to be at Metatopia next week, I'm going to be there. So if you see me, say hi. All three of you who listen to this podcast, if you happen to be in the New Jersey area. So yeah, I think that's everything I had. Buddy, do you have anything else that you wanted to promote?
I have nothing else that I'm looking to promote.
In that case, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.